September 1893. A young woman sits down to write a letter, not to a friend, not to family, but to a 5-year-old boy named Noel, the son of her former governess and close friend. Noel is recovering from scarlet fever, which has kept him in bed for weeks, and Beatrix doesn't know what else to say to comfort him. So instead of words alone, she gives him a story. Page after page, she fills the letter with little ink drawings. A rabbit in a blue coat, sneaking into a garden he was told to stay out of. She had no idea that this letter, written to entertain one sick child, would one day become Peter Rabbit, and that she'd go on to sell over 150 million books in her lifetime. But none of that happens yet. Right now she's just a lonely 27-year-old woman sitting in a house where almost everyone has already decided who she's supposed to become. To understand how a quiet letter to a sick little boy turned into one of the most successful children's franchises in history, we have to go back further, to a childhood spent almost entirely alone. Long before Peter Rabbit became famous, Beatrix Potter spent much of her childhood isolated from other children, surrounded by governesses, tutors, and her collection of pets. While Victorian society expected her to become a proper wife and mother, Beatrix had other ideas. She wanted to study nature, she wanted to draw, and she wanted to tell stories. In Victorian England, society had already decided what a young woman should become. But no matter how much her mother encouraged her to manage a household and marry a suitable man from her social class, Beatrix knew that that life was not for her. Let's turn the clock back to the mid-1800s and discover how a lonely Victorian girl defied the expectations of her time to become the creator of some of the world's most beloved children's stories. A young lonely girl sits alone in her nursery day after day, year after year. Outside, Victorian London is changing rapidly, but inside the Potter household, Helen Beatrix Potter lives a sheltered and isolated life. Born on July 28, 1866, to wealthy parents, Beatrix never experienced the hardships faced by many families of her era. Yet, the privileges of wealth came at an unexpected cost. While other children played with friends, Beatrix spent much of her time with governesses, tutors, and her beloved pets. The natural world became her classroom, and her imagination became her closest companion. Years later, that imagination would give life to Peter Rabbit, Jemima Puddle Duck, and a cast of beloved characters known around the world. But how did a lonely Victorian girl create one of the most treasured worlds in children's literature? When your childhood is spent during the Victorian age, you quickly learn that children are expected to be seen and not heard. In the Potter household, children's voices, and even the sound of laughter, were rarely heard. Beatrix and her brother Bertram seldom played with other children. Their mother was deeply concerned about illness and preferred to keep her children sheltered from outside influences. The house remained quiet. The children remained quiet. As Beatrix grew older, she often felt isolated from the world around her. She found it difficult to share her feelings with her parents and instead turned inward, seeking comfort in her imagination, her pets, and eventually, her writing. At the age of 14, she began keeping a journal. Writing became an outlet for her frustrations and a way to make sense of what she later described as a comfortable, but often lonely, existence. Many of her diary entries were written as letters to an imaginary friend named Esther. Through these letters, Beatrix expressed thoughts and feelings she struggled to share with anyone else. Her mother hoped Beatrix would grow into a proper Victorian lady, obedient, well-mannered, and prepared to help manage the household. But Beatrix wanted something more. She longed for a life filled with nature, learning, and creativity. Confined to the nursery for much of the day, Beatrix grew up almost entirely friendless. She neither shared in her parents' social life nor had many opportunities to meet other children. Although she was deeply solitary, Beatrix was not necessarily unhappy. She learned to value her privacy and found countless ways to occupy herself. Her first governess, Mrs. Hammond, remained with the family until Beatrix was in her early teens. According to family accounts, Mrs. Hammond eventually left because she believed her pupil knew more than she did and had little left to teach her. Even so, Beatrix was saddened by her departure, as the governess had been one of her closest companions. Whenever she had the opportunity to escape the confines of Bolton Gardens, Beatrix eagerly explored the outdoors. These excursions filled her with excitement. She carefully recorded changes in the weather and often included detailed weather reports in her diary entries, regardless of the main subject she was writing about. She was equally fascinated by animals. Along with her brother Bertram, she kept an assortment of pets, including rabbits, lizards, frogs, mice, and insects. Her beloved rabbit Benjamin Bunny became a particular favourite. Beatrix carefully observed her animals' habits and personalities, filling her journals with sketches and notes about them. Occasionally, Mrs. Potter invited Beatrix's cousins to visit. Rather than enjoying these gatherings, Beatrix often found them uncomfortable. Having spent so little time with other children, she felt awkward and unsure of how to interact with them. Her natural shyness made conversation difficult, and she often felt out of place. As she grew older, Beatrix showed little interest in the activities expected of a Victorian young lady. Fashion, tea parties, and ballroom dancing held no appeal for her. She preferred books, nature, and drawing. At social events, Beatrix was often painfully shy. Rather than dancing or mingling with guests, she frequently sat quietly against the wall, avoiding attention and wishing she could be somewhere else entirely. Whenever possible, Beatrix visited London's museums and art galleries. These outings fascinated her, but her mother, Helen Potter, viewed them with some concern. She worried that too much education and intellectual curiosity might encourage Beatrix to seek a career of her own. For a wealthy Victorian woman, that was not considered an appropriate ambition. Mrs. Potter expected her daughter to marry a respectable, well-connected man and devote herself to running a household. A career was simply not part of the plan. But Beatrix had other ideas. She knew that under Victorian society's rules, she would not be allowed to leave home and live independently unless she married. Yet she had little interest in becoming someone's wife. What she wanted was the freedom to pursue her own interests. She wanted to be an artist. Fortunately, her father recognized her talent. Rupert Potter encouraged her artistic ambitions and hired a series of art teachers to give her lessons in oil and watercolour painting. He even created a studio for her in the family home and often took her to galleries and exhibitions throughout London. The happiest moments of the year, however, came when the family left the city behind. Each summer, the Potters travelled to the countryside, often spending weeks in Scotland. There, Beatrix and her brother Bertram experienced a level of freedom they never enjoyed in London. As soon as breakfast was finished, the children would disappear outdoors for hours at a time. Beatrix explored streams, fields, and woodlands, carefully observing the wildlife around her. She could spend hours quietly watching frogs leap through the water or studying animals she had previously known only from books. In Scotland, nature became both her playground and her classroom. The plants, animals, and landscapes she encountered there would inspire her for the rest of her life. Determined not to forget the things she observed during her countryside adventures, Beatrix filled her journals with detailed notes and countless sketches. When the family returned to London, her imagination often went into overdrive. One way she preserved the memories of her travels was by creating magical worlds filled with fairies, talking animals, and adventurous creatures. Then, in 1882, an unexpected change altered the course of her life. The family's usual holiday accommodations were unavailable, so the Potters rented rooms at Wray Castle in England's beautiful Lake District instead. For Beatrix, it was a revelation. The stunning landscapes, abundant wildlife, and peaceful countryside captured her imagination. Over the years, the Lake District would become one of the most important places in her life and a lasting source of inspiration for her stories. As Beatrix entered her 20s, she remained living at home under her parents' supervision. This was considered normal for upper-class Victorian women who were expected to remain with their families until marriage. Yet Beatrix wanted more from life. She longed to continue learning and exploring the natural world. While her brother was able to pursue opportunities unavailable to women, Beatrix found herself limited by the expectations of Victorian society. Determined to challenge herself intellectually, she turned her attention to science. By her early 30s, Beatrix had become deeply interested in fungi. She conducted her own research, carefully studying spores and developing theories about how fungi reproduced. In 1897, she completed a scientific paper titled On the Germination of the Spores of Agariciniae. Because women were not permitted to present papers at the Linnean Society of London, a male scientist submitted the paper on her behalf. The paper received little attention and was ultimately dismissed. It was a bitter disappointment. Despite her intelligence, dedication, and careful research, Beatrix was once again reminded that Victorian society was reluctant to take women seriously as scientists. Around the age of 27, back to the moment we started with, Beatrix wrote a letter to 5-year-old Noel Moore, the oldest son of her former governess and close friend. He'd been sick in bed with scarlet fever for weeks, too ill to go outside. Beatrix wanted to comfort him, but she was at a loss for words, so instead she told him she'd write him a story about 4 little rabbits. What she sent was 8 pages long, filled with her own illustrations. At the time, Beatrix had no idea she was creating one of the most beloved characters in children's literature. Peter was modelled after her own pet rabbit, whom she'd named Peter Piper. Over the next several years, Beatrix kept writing to Noel and his siblings, letter after letter, filled with stories and illustrations of rabbits and other animals. The children kept every single one. Then in 1900, Noel's mother, Annie Moore, had an idea. After rereading the letters, she realised there was enough material, enough story, enough art, to make a real book. She borrowed the letters back from her children and helped Beatrix turn them into what would become The Tale of Peter Rabbit. One publisher after another rejected the book, but Beatrix was not ready to abandon her dream. Rather than giving up, she paid to have a small number of copies printed herself in 1901. The self-published edition was well received and quickly attracted attention. The following year, the publishing company Frederick Warne and Company agreed to release a commercial edition of The Tale of Peter Rabbit. It was an immediate success. For the first time, Beatrix had achieved something entirely on her own, despite years of resistance from her parents and the limitations placed on women of her era. The lonely little girl, who had once filled notebooks with sketches of animals, had finally found her audience. Beatrix went on to write and illustrate more than 20 children's books, including The Tale of Peter Rabbit, The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin, and The Tale of Jemima Puddle Duck. Her stories have delighted readers around the world for more than a century. In the summer of 1905, Beatrix Potter received a marriage proposal from her publisher, Norman Warne. Despite her parents' strong disapproval, she accepted. At 39 years old, Beatrix had finally found both love and independence. Tragically, just 1 month after their engagement, Norman died of lymphatic leukemia while Beatrix was away on holiday. His death devastated her. Following Norman's passing, Beatrix used her book royalties and a small inheritance to purchase Hilltop Farm in England's Lake District. At last, she escaped the London life she had never enjoyed. Over the following decades, she continued to purchase farms and land throughout the region. In 1913, at the age of 47, Beatrix married local solicitor William Heelis. She embraced country life wholeheartedly. Beatrix became an expert on the area's famous Herdwick sheep and eventually earned a reputation as a skilled breeder. She spent much of her time farming, managing her properties and judging livestock competitions. Yet her success as an author never stopped benefiting the countryside she loved. Throughout her later years, Beatrix used the royalties from her books to purchase large areas of threatened farmland and countryside, helping protect them from development and preserving the character of the Lake District for future generations. On December 22, 1943, Beatrix Potter passed away at the age of 77. In her will, she left her estate to her husband, William Heelis, with the provision that upon his death, much of the land would be transferred to the National Trust. William died just 2 years later, on August 4, 1945. As Beatrix had intended, the vast majority of her estate, including 14 farms and more than 4,000 acres of countryside, was transferred to the National Trust, ensuring the preservation of one of England's most beautiful landscapes. The lonely little girl who once escaped into a world of imagination had not only created Peter Rabbit, she had helped save the countryside that inspired him. If this story inspired you, join us as we continue uncovering the lives of women who changed the world. Subscribe to Heroines of History and keep the light of history alive. And let us know in the comments who your favourite heroine is. Bye for now.